Lieutenant Sofia Kovač stood in the humid jungle clearing as Japanese soldiers forced 32 Filipino civilians to kneel in a line, their hands bound behind their backs with rough hemp rope. At 29 years old, she was one of the few American military intelligence officers fluent in Japanese, recruited from her linguistics professorship at Berkeley, when the War Department recognized that effective communication with enemy forces could be as important as conventional military capabilities. But on this sweltering afternoon in March 1945, as American forces advanced through the Philippines toward the final defeat of Japanese occupation forces, Sofia faced a moral crisis that would test her integrity, courage, and understanding of when following orders must be superseded by preventing atrocity. The situation had developed rapidly following the American capture of a small Filipino village that Japanese forces had used as a supply depot and security outpost. The Japanese commander, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto, had surrendered after brief resistance, along with 63 soldiers under his command. Military protocol required processing prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, but it also demanded intelligence gathering about Japanese defensive positions, troop strengths, and strategic planning that could influence ongoing combat operations. Sofia had been assigned as primary translator for interrogating Captain Yamamoto, whose cooperation or resistance would determine how quickly American forces could gather actionable intelligence about Japanese forces still fighting throughout the region. Standard interrogation procedures emphasized that prisoners should be treated according to international law, but they also acknowledged that circumstances sometimes required more aggressive approaches when critical intelligence was needed urgently. The 32 Filipino civilians in the clearing had been identified by Captain Yamamoto as collaborators who had provided intelligence to Japanese forces about American troop movements, partisan activities, and local resistance operations. Under interrogation, Yamamoto had offered to identify these collaborators in exchange for lenient treatment of his own soldiers, creating a bargaining situation that American commanders found strategically valuable but morally complicated. Sofia's background had prepared her exceptionally well for the linguistic challenges of military translation, but nothing in her academic training had addressed the ethical complexities of translating communications that could result in death for innocent people. Born to Croatian immigrants in San Francisco, she had grown up in a multilingual household that emphasized the importance of accurate communication across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Her fascination with Asian languages had begun during undergraduate studies at Berkeley, where she had taken introductory Japanese courses taught by Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese-American scholar who emphasized that language learning required understanding cultural contexts and ethical responsibilities that transcended simple vocabulary and grammar. Sofia had pursued graduate studies in Japanese linguistics, completing her doctorate in 1940, just as American-Japanese relations were deteriorating toward the conflict that would soon transform the Pacific region. What would you do if your translation skills could determine whether innocent people lived or died? When military intelligence recruiters approached Sofia in early 1942, offering her a commission and assignment to Pacific theater operations, she had initially hesitated, understanding that her linguistic skills would be used for purposes far removed from the academic research and cross-cultural understanding that had motivated her language studies. But the attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent Japanese occupation of the Philippines had convinced her that defeating totalitarian aggression required contributions from people with specialized skills, regardless of their personal preferences. Her service as a military translator had been distinguished by accuracy, cultural sensitivity, and the professionalism that earned respect from both intelligence officers and the Japanese prisoners she had interrogated during previous operations. But she had also witnessed disturbing incidents where translation accuracy had been compromised by pressure to produce intelligence results quickly,
where linguistic nuances had been ignored in favor of simplified interpretations that supported predetermined conclusions. The current situation with Captain Yamamoto and the 32 accused Filipino civilians represented these ethical complications in their most extreme form. The Japanese officer was claiming that these villagers had betrayed partisan fighters to Japanese security forces, resulting in the deaths of dozens of Filipino resistance members. If his accusations were accurate, the civilians arguably deserved punishment under the brutal logic of wartime collaboration and betrayal. But Sofia also understood that Yamamoto had powerful incentives to provide false information that might curry favor with his American captors, that identifying innocent civilians as collaborators could serve Japanese interests by creating divisions within Filipino communities, and that translation errors or cultural misunderstandings could result in executing people based on miscommunication rather than actual guilt. The American commander responsible for the operation, Colonel Robert Harrison, had accepted Yamamoto's identification of the 32 civilians as legitimate intelligence and had ordered their immediate execution as collaborators who had caused American casualties through their cooperation with Japanese forces. Harrison's order reflected both military pragmatism and the harsh justice that characterized Pacific Theater operations, where collaboration with Japanese occupiers was treated as a capital offense, deserving immediate punishment. Sofia's role in this situation was ostensibly straightforward: translate Colonel Harrison's execution order to the Filipino civilians so they understood what was about to happen and why. Standard military procedure required that condemned personnel be informed of the charges against them and the sentence being carried out, with translation provided when linguistic barriers prevented direct communication.
But as Sofia looked at the 32 kneeling civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, elderly men and women who showed no signs of the sophistication that would characterize actual intelligence operatives, she experienced profound doubt about whether Yamamoto's accusations were accurate or whether she was about to participate in murdering innocent people based on false information provided by a prisoner trying to save his own soldiers. Have you ever been told to do something legal but morally wrong, where only you could prevent an injustice? The decision Sofia faced was both professional and moral. As a military officer, she had obligations to follow lawful orders from superior officers who had command authority and access to intelligence information that might not be available to subordinate personnel. But as a human being and a linguist who understood the power and responsibility of accurate communication, she also had obligations to ensure that her translations were accurate and that linguistic interpretation didn't result in murdering innocent people. Sofia's response to this crisis reflected her understanding that translation involves interpretation, and that interpreters have ethical responsibilities that transcend simple word-for-word conversion between languages. Rather than simply translating Colonel Harrison's execution order as commanded, she made a split-second decision to intentionally mistranslate, telling the Filipino civilians in Tagalog that they were being detained for questioning rather than being informed of their imminent execution. The mistranslation gave Sofia crucial time to pursue an alternative approach that might prevent the executions while maintaining her professional role as translator. She immediately requested a private conference with Colonel Harrison, arguing that proper interrogation of the accused civilians was essential before executing them, and that her linguistic skills would be necessary for conducting such interrogations effectively. Harrison was initially defensive to Sofia's suggestion, arguing that Yamamoto's identification of the collaborators was sufficient evidence and that battlefield justice required swift action rather than prolonged legal proceedings. But Sofia persisted, emphasizing that executing innocent civilians based solely on statements from a Japanese prisoner could create political complications with Filipino partisan forces that American operations depended upon for intelligence and tactical support.
Sofia's argument eventually convinced Harrison to delay the executions pending interrogation of the accused civilians, but she also understood that this reprieve was temporary, and that she would need to demonstrate conclusively that Yamamoto's accusations were false if she hoped to prevent the executions from eventually proceeding. The burden of proof had effectively shifted from the accused civilians to Sofia herself, requiring her to conduct investigations that went far beyond her assigned duties as military translator. The interrogation Sofia conducted over the following 48 hours revealed systematic inconsistencies in Yamamoto's accusations that suggested he had fabricated the collaboration charges. The accused civilians provided verifiable alibis, showing they had been in different locations when the alleged intelligence sharing occurred. They demonstrated complete ignorance of military information that actual collaborators would have possessed, and their personal backgrounds showed no connections to Japanese occupation forces or motivations for collaboration. Sofia's linguistic analysis of Yamamoto's original statements revealed subtle indicators of deception that were only apparent to someone with deep understanding of Japanese language and culture. His word choices, grammatical structures, and cultural references suggested he was inventing accusations rather than describing actual events he had witnessed. Sofia documented these linguistic deception indicators in a detailed report that challenged the credibility of Yamamoto's collaboration accusations. But Sofia's investigation also revealed the actual reason Yamamoto had identified these specific 32 civilians for execution. The villagers were relatives and friends of Filipino partisan leaders who had been particularly effective in conducting resistance operations against Japanese occupation forces. Yamamoto's accusations represented a final attempt to strike at the partisan networks even in defeat, using American forces to carry out revenge killings that would demoralize Filipino resistance and demonstrate Japanese ability to cause harm even after surrendering. Sofia presented her findings to Colonel Harrison with a comprehensive analysis showing that executing the 32 civilians would represent a gross miscarriage of justice based on deliberately false accusations from a Japanese officer pursuing strategic goals even in captivity. Her report included testimony from the accused civilians, verification of their alibis through independent sources, linguistic analysis of Yamamoto's deception indicators, and assessment of the strategic motivations underlying his false accusations. Harrison's response to Sofia's investigation demonstrated both the best and worst aspects of military decision-making during wartime. He was initially defensive about his hasty acceptance of Yamamoto's accusations, resistant to admitting error that would require him to acknowledge he had nearly executed innocent civilians. But he was also professional enough to recognize that Sofia's analysis was compelling and that proceeding with executions would represent both a moral failure and a tactical error that could damage relations with Filipino partisan forces. The final resolution came when Harrison ordered the 32 civilians released and transferred Yamamoto to a prisoner of war camp, where his ability to cause further harm would be restricted. But Harrison also reprimanded Sofia for her initial mistranslation of his execution order, arguing that she had exceeded her authority by deliberately providing inaccurate translation even if her intentions had been to prevent injustice. Sofia accepted the reprimand without protest, understanding that she had indeed violated military protocols by intentionally mistranslating an order from a superior officer. But she also understood that her actions had saved 32 innocent lives and had prevented a moral catastrophe that would have haunted everyone involved while also damaging American strategic interests in the Philippines.
The incident's broader implications extended beyond the immediate situation in that single Filipino village. Sofia's investigation and her courageous decision to mistranslate the execution order led to reforms in how intelligence from enemy prisoners was evaluated before being acted upon, with enhanced requirements for corroboration and verification before accepting accusations that could result in civilian deaths.
Let us know in the comments what you think about breaking rules to prevent greater wrongs. Sofia continued serving as military translator throughout the remainder of the war, participating in interrogations and intelligence operations during the final campaigns in the Philippines and the eventual occupation of Japan. Her reputation as a linguist who prioritized accuracy over convenience and who understood the ethical responsibilities of translation made her valuable for sensitive operations requiring cultural sensitivity and moral judgment. The 32 Filipino civilians whose lives Sofia had saved through her mistranslation and subsequent investigation remained grateful throughout their lives, with several sending letters to Sofia after the war expressing appreciation for her courage in standing against military authority to prevent injustice. Their testimony about her actions contributed to her receiving a Bronze Star for meritorious service, with a citation recognizing her exceptional professional skill and moral courage in ensuring accuracy of intelligence analysis and preventing the execution of innocent civilians based on false enemy accusations. But Sofia herself remained deeply conflicted about the incident throughout her life, understanding that she had violated military discipline and professional translator ethics by deliberately providing inaccurate translation even for admirable reasons. Her experience convinced her that translation work involved profound ethical responsibilities that transcended simple linguistic accuracy, requiring translators to understand the consequences of their work and to accept personal responsibility for ensuring that language barriers didn't result in injustice. After the war, Sofia returned to academic life at Berkeley, where she taught courses in Japanese language and culture that emphasized the ethical dimensions of cross-cultural communication. Her wartime experiences influenced her approach to teaching, emphasizing that language professionals had responsibilities extending beyond technical accuracy to include moral awareness of how their work affected real people in real situations. In 1952, Sofia published a memoir titled The Translator's Burden: Language, Ethics, and War, which discussed her experiences as a military translator and particularly the incident involving the 32 Filipino civilians. The book became influential in professional translation circles, contributing to discussions about the ethical responsibilities of interpreters working in situations where their linguistic skills could influence matters of life and death. The memoir also contributed to broader discussions about individual moral responsibility within military hierarchies, arguing that following orders could not excuse participation in injustice when individuals possessed information and capabilities that could prevent wrong outcomes. Sofia's willingness to accept official reprimand, while also defending her decision to mistranslate the execution order, demonstrated that moral courage sometimes required accepting professional consequences for doing what conscience demanded. Sofia Kovač died in 1987 at age 71, having devoted her life to teaching that language work involved profound ethical responsibilities and that linguistic skills should serve human welfare rather than simply facilitating communication regardless of consequences. Her legacy includes not just the 32 lives she saved through her courageous mistranslation, but also her contribution to professional ethics discussions that influenced how translators and interpreters understood their responsibilities in situations where language barriers intersected with questions of justice and human rights. Today, the incident involving Sofia's mistranslation is taught in military ethics courses and professional translator training programs as an example of how individual moral courage can prevent institutional injustice even at personal cost. Her story demonstrates that sometimes the most important service individuals can provide is not following orders efficiently, but recognizing when following orders would result in moral catastrophe and having the courage to accept responsibility for preventing such outcomes. The village where the 32 civilians were nearly executed eventually erected a small memorial recognizing Sofia's courage, with an inscription in both English and Tagalog that reads, "In memory of Lieutenant Sofia Kovač, who understood that words have power, that translation carries responsibility, and that sometimes preventing injustice requires the courage to say no, even when all authority demands yes." Lieutenant Sofia Kovač proved that individual moral courage can prevent institutional injustice even when hierarchies demand compliance, and that professional responsibilities sometimes require accepting personal consequences for refusing to participate in wrong actions regardless of legal authorization. Her courageous mistranslation saved 32 innocent lives and demonstrated that language professionals have ethical obligations that transcend simple accuracy, requiring them to accept responsibility for ensuring their skills serve human welfare rather than facilitating harm. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.